Hello everyone. Today I'm going to talk about the interpersonal metafunction primarily, but first I will introduce this by way of talking very briefly about functional grammar and the three metafunctions of language. And then, as I said, we'll look at the interpersonal metafunction in detail now, and you will see the other two metafunctions later. So functional grammar is something that you'll see in a lot of the book titles that I recommend you use to further your studies, right? Introducing functional grammar, the functional analysis of English, Halliday's introduction to functional grammar. You see functional here always, and then Halliday is a man, M.A.K. Halliday, he's Michael Halliday, is the researcher, linguist, theorist who's most associated with the idea of functional grammar. Now, what is functional grammar? You may not realize it, but there are different ways of explaining how language works, how the grammatical aspect of language works. There's no one book. Sometimes people think that there's a book that explains grammar and that's just how it is. That's not the reality, right? We have language, and then over time people have developed ways of explaining how language works, but there are competing theories as to which explanation is best. You probably, from your early days as a student, looked at grammar. Your teacher probably just called it grammar. Traditional grammar is the way I've phrased it here, because it doesn't really have a name in many cases other than to say, when people talk about grammar and they use terms like noun and verb and present tense and past tense and adjective and adverb and so on, they're talking about grammar. And that's fine. And knowing those terms is very useful. But then what we're talking about today and in other videos that I've prepared for you is a different way of explaining how language works. It has various names, but you'll always have that functional in there, functional grammar. Some of the terms used in functional grammar are different, right? In traditional grammar, I, you, he, she might be called a pronoun. In functional grammar, those words I, you, he, she would be called personal references. Now, they're referring to the same thing, right? I, you, he, she. What does pronoun mean? I mean, you know what it is, I, you, he, she, but what does it mean? It's not a word that most of us know the etymology of, right? Whereas if you call I, you, he, she a personal reference, in many ways that's just easier to grasp, right? What does she do when you use it? Well, it's a word, she, that reference to a person, personal. For the most part, of course we can use she to refer to non-humans, right? But in general, I, you, he, she, we, they refer to people. And so calling them personal references is more intuitively easy to grasp than calling it pronoun much of the time, right? And there are other examples of that, and that's not the purpose of today's talk, right? But today I just wanted to start, as I said, by saying that you will see terms in discussions of functional grammar that appear to just be synonymous for other terms you already know from having studied traditional grammar. Knowing the traditional grammar terms is a very good base to have. Your teacher was not wrong when she or he told you that this is a noun, this is an adverb, and so on. You can think of functional grammar and the functional grammatical terms as an addition that can sometimes just be synonymous, sometimes offers more precise ways of describing language, and therefore people who use functional grammar think that the functional grammar terms that Halliday and others came up with is just a better way of explaining grammar, right? Both more precise and more intuitive, more simpler, right? Simpler. They're maybe not simple now if you don't know the terms, but overall simpler because the terms are intuitive and because they offer more precision and more range for explaining how language works. So that's my general overview. Now, what Halliday did is said something like, everybody knows language is used to express meaning, right? If you ask people, what's language? They'll say something like this: language is used to express meaning. But how can we then talk in more detail about what this means? In other words, what is meaning, right? To say meaning, what does that mean? Well, Halliday broke language, any bit of language, he said any bit of language, we can look at the meaning from 3 points of view. That language describes an experience, right? Something happens and you choose to talk about it or write about it, of course. So you use language to describe some experience that you saw, that you heard, that you felt, that you thought, right? The language is used for describing experiences. And so he had the experiential metafunction is one of the 3 metafunctions. Language is used interpersonally. We use language between people. We talk to people. We write for people. We listen to people. That when you use language, you have to make choices to signal how you're relating to the people with whom you're talking or to whom you're writing. And so he called this the interpersonal metafunction. And finally, every time you write or say something, you have to organize the language in a certain way. I mean, just think of what's the difference between saying, I saw him yesterday and yesterday I saw him, right? You may think, well, in meaning, those are the same. I saw him yesterday, yesterday I saw him. That in meaning, they're the same. But what Halliday and others show is that there are patterns to this organization. There are reasons that sometimes we might say, I saw him yesterday, and reasons that other times we might say, yesterday I saw him. So how is the language organized is what Halliday called the textual metafunction of language. So these 3 things, the experiential, the interpersonal, and the textual, are 3 ways of looking at how language works to create meaning. Now, I've listed them here, experiential, interpersonal, and textual, in that order because that's the order they often appear in discussions. But today I'm going to talk about the interpersonal metafunction first because in my experience, it's probably the easiest one to grasp, right? The one that's best to know first before moving on to the others. So now we'll move to the specific details of talking about the interpersonal metafunction. Now, what you need to know here in understanding the interpersonal metafunction is just the 2 parts that are in blue and red. The rest of any clause can be ignored when discussing the basic elements of the interpersonal metafunction. These are the 2 things that you need to know, the subject and the finite. The subject of any clause is what you already know as the subject from knowing about traditional grammar, right? Usually it's the thing or person that did something, right? Not always, but let's leave it like that for now, right? The subject is in the discussion of the interpersonal metafunction in functional grammar, the subject is the same as you know it to be in traditional grammar, right? So you have sentences like this: Jim did take her calculator, or her calculator was taken by Jim. And in both of those, the subject is highlighted in blue. Now, in the first one, Jim did take, you'll recognize that as the subject because Jim was the one who did the taking, right? In the second one, her calculator is definitely the subject, right? It's grammatically the subject. But then you'll realize, but the calculator didn't do anything here. Well, you're right, Jim still did the taking, but the calculator is the subject. That's why a minute ago I said, usually we can say the subject is the thing or person that did something, but that's not always the case, right? As you should recognize here, the subject is, in both of these cases, Jim and her calculator. Well, the subject is the word, or in the case of Jim, or the phrase in the case of her calculator, that comes before the verb, that has a relationship with the verb, but it's not always accurate to say that it's the thing that did something. You have the subject. Then the part that may be new to you here is the part in red called the finite. You may have heard that term in other things like finite verb or infinitive and so on. Here it's the finite. It's important to say the finite. We're talking about the finite. How Halliday defines this is the first word of the verb or verb phrase, right? Look at Jim did take her calculator. Here the verb is made up of two parts, did take. In her calculator was taken by Jim, here the verb is made up of two parts, two words, right? Was taken. All that you need to do is use the first word of the verb phrase. That's it, right? So the finite is just the first word of the verb, or if the verb is longer, the verb phrase. So Jim did and her calculator was. Those are the subject and the finite. Those are the only two parts that are needed for the discussion of the interpersonal metafunction. Never mind the rest. I've labeled it there, but I'm not even going to say or explain the labels because they're not needed. They're labeled to show you that they do have names, but we don't need them for the discussion of the interpersonal metafunction. Wave them away as I've done here on the slide. So, what is the finite? The first word of the verb group, right? Here are some examples. Will be, might be, is running, has done, right? The finite is just the first word of all of those, right? In the case of will, it's a modal verb. In the case of might, it's a modal verb as well. In the case of is, it's an auxiliary verb that shows you the tense and aspect, right? The tense is present, the aspect is continuous, and so on for he's done it. You don't need to know all those terms, tense, aspect, modal. I mean, you may know them, great. That's not the point today. Again, I'm just saying that you can explain what these are in other ways, but for the purposes of the discussion of the interpersonal metafunction, it's enough to just say it's the finite because it's the first word of the verb and of all the words that make up the verb. And it could be longer, right? He should have been running, should have been running, should have been running. 4 words. What's the finite? Should. Just the first word, right? So it doesn't matter how long it is, you just take the first one. That's how you find the finite. Now, sometimes with verbs like here, he walks to work, there is only one word. He walks to work. What you do there to decide what the finite is you imagine that walks, that you unpack it into 2 words, right? You realize, as you probably see here, that he walks to work. We can say he does walk to work, and it essentially means the same thing. You'd probably only say that if you were being emphatic, right? He does walk to work. You wanted to emphasize it. But you haven't changed anything in terms of the polarity. I mean, it's still positive, right? It's he walks, not he doesn't walk. You haven't changed the tense, right? It's still present. You haven't changed the aspect. It's still simple, right? He walks to work. He does walk to work. When you see a one-word verb like that, like walks, imagine that it can be opened up or unpacked into does walk. The finite, therefore, is the first of those two, does. Stick with me. You'll see why this matters soon. Right? It's visible in, I'm going to put them all up. The finite is visible in all of these patterns, right? When you have a negative, Jim did not take, you can see that Jim and did. When you make a question, right, or grammatically best to call it an interrogative, did Jim? When you're emphasizing something, Jim did take, you see the Jim and the did again. In all of those cases, you can see the subject Jim and the finite did. In the pattern, the standard declarative, you're saying something and it's not emphatic and it's not negative, you don't see it anymore, right? You see Jim took. Now, so here's where you want to recognize that that did exists, right? That Jim took, you could say Jim did take, and you'd mean the same thing. And you can see probably now how the finite matters in terms of interpersonal relations, right? When I say Jim took her calculator, you don't see that finite. If I want to use any other pattern, I have to take that finite out of took and separate it into did take. And for example, if I want to ask you a question, I have to move the did to the front, right? Jim took separates into Jim did take. the did goes to the front, and we end up with the question, did Jim take? Similarly, if you want to make Jim took into a negative, well, how do we make things negative in English? We can't say Jim tookn't her calculator. We need a finite did to attach a not onto it. So Jim took becomes Jim did take, and then we add the not, Jim did not take. And sometimes we compress it with a contraction and say Jim didn't take. So that's possible too, right? The contracted form. But in all of those patterns, we need the finite we need to see the finite for the negative and the interrogative and the emphatic. And so we have to unpack it out of the declarative. The types of words then that are finite are the words that show tense, right? Words like be in any of its forms, right? I am walking, I was walking, they are going, they were going. Have does this too, right? I have seen, I had seen. Can you think of the other one that does this? Do, right? I do play tennis, I did play tennis, right? These show the tense, past or present. Modality, you know the modal verbs, right? Can, could, shall, should, and so on. All of these ones. And that's all you need for those. What you should recognize is that if it's negative is, let me show you the example. If it's negative, you should think of the not as being part of the finite. You can probably picture that if you do what I did a couple of slides back. Think about they won't be there. How would you turn that into a question the most normal way? You'd take that finite, won't, right? The whole verb in the sentence one here, they won't be there. The whole verb is won't be. If you wanted to turn that into an interrogative, you would move won't to the front, right? You'd say, won't they be there? And that's how you'd make it into a question. So include the negative, if there is one, with the first word of the verb in order to locate the finite. See it for these two. They might not be there, she isn't running, and so on. Yes, it's possible to do different things, right? And you may have thought of them now, but you'll notice I said the most usual way to make a question is just to move the finite, including the negative, to the front. So for example, with number 3, as a declarative, you say she isn't running. As an interrogative, you'd say, isn't she running? You'd move the whole isn't to the front of the sentence. I realize you can say, is she not running? It's possible, but that's a less common form, right? Think of the most common form. You'd say, hasn't he done it? Rather than, has he not done it? Possible, less common. The finite is the first word of the verb, and if there is a negative, it includes the word not. One more example. You may not believe what I've just written here now, if I'm not explaining this well, but as I said at the start, it's probably easiest for getting the overall picture of the 3 metafunctions to start with the interpersonal metafunction, because it is, as Jeff Thompson says, probably the easiest to grasp. That reference is at the end of this presentation if you want it. We have these 3 basic interpersonal structures, right? Structure, as you may know, here is being used to say grammar, particularly the aspect of grammar to do with word order. Look how the word order has changed with these 3 basic structures that we have available to us in English. One by one, more carefully, more slowly, let's say. A declarative is this pattern, Jim did take her calculator. An interrogative is this pattern, did Jim take her calculator? An imperative is this pattern, take her calculator. Look what's happened there. For the declarative, the order is subject finite, Jim did. For the interrogative, the order is finite subject, did Jim. For the imperative, there is no finite. and there's no subject. Look at, right? You can't say, take Did her calculator, or take Jim her calculator, or something like that, right? When we use an imperative, there is a subject, but the subject is usually understood from the context, right? If you ask me, I need help with this math, I can't solve this long multiplication, I could say, take her calculator. Who is the take directed at? Well, to you, because you just asked me, right? I might look at someone and say, come here, please. Now, again, from the context, where am I looking or where am I gesturing, right? Help me, please, with a hand wave. Help me, the subject comes from whoever my hand wave is directed at. So normally in an imperative, the subject is not said or written, and the finite is also not said or written. See that in these three, right? How it disappears. The Jim and the did have disappeared in the imperative. Again, to highlight that, right? Declarative, interrogative, imperative. Use those terms. Sometimes people might call number one a statement, but statement has other uses, you know, a witness statement in the law or something. Sometimes people might not call number two a question. But if you think of a question, you know, if I hold up a jug of coffee and say coffee, you may want to call that a question, because it is, right? I'm offering you coffee. Coffee? But there's no grammar there to tell that, right? That if you take coffee as a question because of my rising intonation, coffee, and because I'm holding a pot, I'm sort of waving it at you, it's not grammatically a question because it doesn't have that finite subject did Jim pattern, right? So try to use these terms. If it's subject finite, call it a declarative. If it's finite subject, call it an interrogative. And if it's no subject, no finite, call it an imperative. As you see, that's what I just said, right? That it's the movement or the disappearance of subject finite that tell us which of the three grammatical structures we're using. Did Jim, Jim did, or neither. These three options, right, subject finite, finite subject, and no finite, no subject, these are called the mood system of English. That's why people will say declarative mood, interrogative mood, and imperative mood. Those are the three options that you have available when you want to interpersonal, right? When you want to use language between people, right? I'm a person, you're a person, I'm talking to you, that you can see why it's called interpersonal metafunction, right? The metafunction, the function of language, the higher level meta, right? The higher level function of language is that it allows us to talk to people, or to write, of course. When we want to talk to people in English, we only have three choices. We can tell them something, a declarative. How do you know I'm telling you something? Because I use the subject finite pattern. She is. David can. The news said. The weather is. Those are declaratives. The other option I have is to ask you something. Is the weather? Can David? Will she? Interrogatives. Or I can prompt you to do something. Prompt is, sometimes imperatives are called commands. They may be, if we're, it would depend on tone of voice and context, right? In the military, right? Maybe come here, soldier is a command. But imperatives aren't always commanding, right? If we're having dinner and I say, pass the salt, please. That sounds polite, right? Polite tone of voice. I added a please. Pass the salt, please. That's an imperative, but it doesn't really feel like a command, right? So that's why earlier, and usually I'll try to use the word prompt someone to do something, right? When I want to use language to talk to you, my three options in English grammar are to use the declarative mood, the interrogative mood, or the imperative mood. I like you is declarative mood. So you have the subject finite pattern for declaratives. Jim took, which we know can be unpacked as Jim did take, or her calculator was taken, right? Those are both subject finite, so those are both declarative mood. No subject, no finite, take her calculator, something like this. Can you put the subject and the finite in the other order? They're not there, so there is no discussion of which order they're in. And for the interrogative, we have a couple of patterns. Did Jim take her calculator? Was her calculator taken by Jim? Finite and subject in both of these cases. I'm asking you something. Now there is one little extra detail here that complicates things a bit, right? Did Jim take her calculator is a yes or a no, right? Your answers to that are yes or no, or of course you can say I don't know or maybe, right? But it's called a yes or a no question, a yes or a no interrogative, because the expected answer is a yes or a no. I'm asking you about the polarity, positive or negative. Positive, yes, negative, no. Did Jim take her calculator, yes or no? We do have the other kind of question with the WH at the start, right? Who, what, where, when, why, and of course how, which is not WH, but the W and the H are there, just in the wrong order. The pattern is the same, except that you've added the WH word to the start. What did she lose? We still have the finite, did, and the subject, she, after it, so it's an interrogative, but you put one of the WH words at the start. And that carries over for where and so on. It's this last one that's a bit tricky, right? Who has taken her calculator? What we have here is a case where the who is both the subject and the question word. If you look at what did she lose, sometimes people aren't sure how to find the subject of an interrogative. Look at what did she lose. In your head, or write it down, how would you turn that into a declarative? What movement would you make to turn what did she lose into a declarative? You'd change it to she did lose her calculator, right? The what there is asking you for information that would be replaced by the object of the verb lose, right? She did lose her calculator. Similarly, for where has her calculator gone, turn that into a question, right? Turn that into a declarative. You'd put her calculator has gone in the bin, something like that, right? So her calculator is the subject here. But in who has taken her calculator, that job of subject and the question word are actually the same word. I'm not saying here that you would say who has taken her calculator. When you say who has taken her calculator, you have the question word who, but note that who is also the subject here. You don't know who did it, but in terms of grammar, who is the subject? Because think about how would you turn that last sentence, the interrogative, into a declarative? You would answer by saying, Jim has taken her calculator. So they're the missing information, right, represented by the word in green. The word in green in all of these is the missing information. But with what did she lose, the missing information is the object. With where has her calculator gone, the missing information is the location of the calculator, which would probably be a prepositional phrase like in the bin. With who, the missing information is the subject. So in that case, and that case only, the order is subject finite. I just said over and over that with interrogatives, the order of an interrogative is finite subject. The order of an interrogative is finite then subject, except in this case here, where you ask a question that the missing information is in fact the subject. Of course, you still know it's an interrogative, right? Because it starts with the word who. And when it's written form, it's got a question mark. And in spoken form, there might be some intonation to help you see that it's an interrogative. What I've done here is what I just said on the previous, while I was talking about the previous slide. If you want to pause here and look at it, please do. This is showing you how to locate the subject of an interrogative. I know from experience it's the thing that people sometimes have a bit of difficulty with. Take the question, the interrogative, turn it into a declarative, then you'll probably find that the subject is a lot more apparent, a lot easier to spot. How do you identify the subject and the finite in longer sentences? Here's some advice on that. Now, of course, you may be able to do it just by looking. Great. Another way to do it is like this, right? Add a tag question. She was shopping in the town, wasn't she? When you add a tag question, what you do is you take the finite, in this case was, you reverse it from positive to negative or negative to positive. In this case, we have she was shopping. The finite is was. When you make a tag question, you turn it around and make it wasn't. And then you add on the subject again. I'm sure that you make tag questions all the time and you do it without thinking about the grammar. What I'm saying here is this is what you're doing, right? With any declarative, you want to add a tag question, you very quickly in your mind, without even probably being aware of it, you locate the finite, you reverse the polarity, you make positive negative or negative positive, and then you add on the subject at the end. So if you have trouble with she was shopping in the town, which one's the subject, which one's the finite, make a tag question and you'll see, there's the subject, she, there's the finite, was. I probably shouldn't have put nt in red here. The finite of she was shopping in the town is was. You made it negative to make the tag question, but as far as locating the finite of the original clause, she was shopping in the town, it's just the word was. Sorry for highlighting the N''T in red. I shouldn't have done that. Something a bit longer. Running a hotel isn't as easy as it might look, is it? What's the subject? What's the finite? Well, think of how you'd make the tag question, or I just did it. Is it? There's your is, the finite, right? You've reversed isn't in the original clause. Running a hotel isn't. You've taken that finite isn't, reversed it to is, and then you've added the subject. But we don't add the whole subject. We turn the subject into a personal reference, right? Into a pronoun in traditional grammatical terms. You say this, running a hotel isn't as easy as it might look, is it? You quickly turned the subject, running a hotel, into the personal reference, it. So if you want to know the subject and the finite of running a hotel isn't, add the tag question. Notice that you turned running a hotel into it. So the subject is running a hotel. The finite is isn't, right? You reversed it to is for the tag question, but you want the finite from the original clause, so you want the negative included, right? Remember I said you include the nt, so you include the negative, the either N''T or the not. Try it with it, well, I was going to say try it with this one, but of course I've already put the answer on, right? These two quotations exemplify many of the points. Don't they? They, you can see, refers to these two quotations. So the subject is these two quotations. Don't comes from you realizing that exemplify can be unpacked as do exemplify. So then you unpacked the exemplify into do exemplify. You took the finite do and you reversed the polarity and made it don't. So if you wanted to identify the subject of this final one, you know the subject is these two quotations and the finite is do. Color coded it all the way here if you want to pause and see that. Why should we care about this, right? As it says here, the finite makes it possible to talk about the validity of the clause. The validity, what does that mean? Coming, right? With the subject as the central point. When you make a clause, you choose a subject, she, running a hotel, these 2 points. You choose something to talk about. Then what you do is you add on, your sentence continues, your clause continues by choosing a finite. Now that finite may be something that you want to say is well, they're examples, right? You may want to say that the thing you're talking about, let's keep that example, running a hotel, right? I can talk about running a hotel to you in various ways. I can talk about it in the past or the present or the future or unreal situations. What does that mean? Well, I say running a hotel is or running a hotel isn't, right? For past and present, running a hotel is or running a hotel was. That immediately tells you whether I'm talking about past or present. Running a hotel is, running a hotel was. I might also talk about it as positive or negative. Running a hotel is, running a hotel isn't. Running a hotel was, running a hotel wasn't. I might talk about it, as it says here, to the extent that it is valid. If I say is or isn't, I'm talking about it as it's absolute, right? It's absolutely true, is. It absolutely isn't true, isn't. Or it's absolutely true in the past, was. Or it's absolutely not true in the past, wasn't. But we don't always have to talk about things being absolutely true. We can choose a finite that shows something is less than 100%, right? I can say running a hotel may, running a hotel might, running a hotel could be, right? Could. Running a hotel couldn't, right? I can say all of these things. The modals can also tell you that whatever else comes doesn't matter, right? The residue, anything else doesn't matter. It matters when we talk about other metafunctions. When we talk about interpersonal, it's enough to say, as soon as I say something like running a hotel is, I'm talking about running a hotel, and with is, I'm talking about it in the present, I'm talking about it being positive, and I'm talking about it without any modality. I'm saying it as if it's absolutely 100% true. I might be lying, I might be wrong. That's not the issue. I'm saying it as if it's true. Every finite includes these bits of information: tense, polarity, and modality. You see the tense with the movement from was to is in the first one. You see the polarity changing from positive to negative with the second one, right? Know becomes don't know. You see the modality changing in the third one. A says it could be. That's not 100% true, right? Not 100%, not... Again, we don't know if it's true or not. A says it as if A is not sure if it's true or not. B replies by saying it as if it is 100% true. That's all you have to look at when talking about the finite and the subject, right? The finite gives you that information about tense, polarity, and modality. Let's see some more, right? Some more movement here is becomes was. The tense is changed from present to past. Is becomes is not or is not. The polarity is changed from positive to negative. That's how you refer to those, right? If it says is, was, may, might, it's positive polarity. If it says isn't, might not, was not, it's called negative polarity. Like North Pole, South Pole are opposites, is, isn't are opposites. It only refers to whether there is a not in the clause or not. It has nothing to do with the absolute meaning. Sometimes people will say, if I give a sentence like, a man was murdered last night. A man was murdered last night. That's positive polarity because it's a man was. So it's positive polarity. It's a horrible thing for the man, but we're only talking about the grammar here, right? A man was murdered last night is positive polarity because the grammar of the finite was is positive. A man wasn't murdered is negative because it's wasn't, and that's negative polarity. That's all that matters, not the rest of the sentence. Modality, as you see here, something that's presented as absolutely true has become possibly less than true. She could be. Always think of that, right? When you're looking at the interpersonal metafunction, when you're talking about the interpersonal metafunction, you want to find the subject and the finite. Once you've done that, you look at the finite and say, is this finite present or past? Is it positive or negative? And is it presented as an absolute, isn't, or is it presented as modal modalized, could, might be, maybe, should, and so on. So in any declarative, you're introducing the subject, she, running a hotel, these 2 points, and then you're saying about whether it's true or not, absolutely true, possibly true, positive, negative, and so on. She was sacked by Nat last week, right? I'm talking about she. I'm talking about something that happened in the past, was. I'm talking about it being absolutely true. Again, I may be wrong, but I'll stop saying that. It's just because sometimes people say, but what if you're lying? What if you're wrong? That's not what we're talking about here. It's just the way I'm saying it. When I say she was, it's presented as absolutely true, in the past was, and positive, she was. Remember, it's bad news for her, but in terms of grammar, this is positive polarity. And then the rest of it, the information, is not something we care about when talking about the interpersonal metafunction. That'll be discussed when we talk about the experiential metafunction. As I said, positive polarity refers only to grammar, nothing to do with meaning. You can see that in these examples. Subject finite tells us why, and rather how you negotiate, how you talk, how you choose to relate to the people that are listening to you, or as always, that are reading something you wrote. It's only the choices I make when I talk to you are whether I'm telling you something, subject finite, asking you something, finite subject, or prompting you to do something, as in the imperatives, right? Take this, come here. We don't care about the rest. It's called the residue in Halliday and Linguistics. Think of residues or, some gross stuff on your shoe or something, right? A bit of residue doesn't matter, right? Yes, don't have to think about it for talking about the interpersonal metafunction. Sorry, I just paused for a second because I needed a quick break. Let me get moving again. Other types of clauses, right? What are you doing in terms of the interpersonal metafunction with other types of clauses? With yes, no's, you're asking someone to clarify the polarity, right? Can he paint? Positive polarity, yes. Negative polarity, no. With WH questions, you're asking to fill in some other part of the message, as I talked about several slides back. Asking to fill in, why did the affair end? Think of as a declarative, the affair ended because. Why is asking you to fill in the reason. As you see there, who has been sleeping in my bed? As we saw earlier, this is asking you to fill in the subject, right? Who has been sleeping in my bed? A bear has been sleeping in my bed. Or no, that's not the way the story goes. It's Little Red Riding Hood. Whichever fairy tale it is when the girl sleeps in the bear's bed. Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Who's been sleeping in my bed? Goldilocks has been sleeping in my bed. The who is asking you to fill in the subject in that case. See, I got it backwards here. It wasn't a bear, it was Goldilocks. The bear was complaining about Goldilocks. In imperatives, what happens? You don't have the subject or the finite. Notice it says imperative unmarked. By unmarked here, I mean, and linguists using the term unmarked mean the usual pattern. Other possibilities exist, but the usual pattern with imperatives, we just start with the imperative verb. Be quiet, come here, read this, turn left, go up the stairs. It's possible to mark them as negative, right? Of course, any of those things I just said could be don't, right? Don't go up the stairs, don't turn left, don't be quiet, and so on. In that case, you put in the don't, but there's no finite there. It's just making the verb itself, the imperative verb itself, negative. The finite here then in the imperatives only shows you the polarity. There's no tense and there's no modality, right? You can't add modality to imperative. You can't say could be quiet. If you say could you be quiet, that's not an imperative anymore. That's become an interrogative. You're asking the person. Yes, I realize you're sort of implying they should be. Could you be quiet? But that's an interrogative because it's got could as the finite and you as the subject. With imperatives, the don't only shows, the only thing we can show is positive or negative polarity. There's no tense, right? You can't make an imperative into the past or the present, right? People sometimes don't quite get that. But if I say be quiet, if you're being noisy now and I say be quiet, probably from context, you'd say, he wants me to be quiet now. If you ask me, how can I learn more about this? And I say, read page 10 of Thompson's book. Read page 10 of Thompson's book. If I say that, read page 10, do you think I mean to do it right now? Probably not, because I'm talking to you now and I'm not finished. So if I said read, which is an imperative, read page 10 of Thompson's book, you'd think to yourself, he means later when I have time. So with imperatives, you don't know when to do it from the word itself. You know from the context, from what makes sense, right? If I say turn left at the next corner, obviously the turn is an imperative. Turn left at the next corner. When are you to do it? Not right now. In the future, when you get to the next corner, that's when you turn left. So there's no tense either. There's just the positive and negative polarity. Imperatives can be marked, right? Don't argue with me would be unmarked. You can put the subject in. We do it sometimes to emphasize things, right? I heard someone on the phone talking, arguing really, and I heard someone say, you be quiet. You know exactly what the person on the other end of the phone said right before that, right? If you hear someone on the phone say, you be quiet, that's an imperative, but the speaker has marked it with you. Obviously, the other person has just said, be quiet. The speaker now says, you be quiet. That speaker wanted to keep the be quiet part of the clause, but wanted to emphatically point out that the being quiet should happen, but not by me, by you at the other end of the line. You be quiet. So you be quiet is an imperative, be quiet, but the subject you appears, so it's marked, right? But you can see why it's marked. The person wanted to emphasize you be quiet. Or like this example here, don't you argue with me. Or do be quiet, right? I mean, be quiet is imperative. Do be quiet. The do is added on just to make it more emphatic, right? Be quiet. Do be quiet. You don't need them. They're added to make it more emphatic. The unmarked imperative of the first one would be don't argue with me. The unmarked imperative of the second one would be quiet. So you can add things to an imperative, but they're not necessary. For grammar. For grammar, you just need the imperative verb and whatever else follows in the residue. Another example. You can always pause and look at it. So the finite only appears for polarity, not for tense and modality. You can add other information, but it's not grammatically necessary. You can add it for emphatic purposes or other purposes, comic purposes, and so on. Can you do this now? Here we've got the mouse from the children's book, The Gruffalo. I believe the first line is, a mouse took a walk in a deep dark wood. Pause. Can you identify the subject? Can you identify the finite? Pause. And now you're back. You should be realizing here that a mouse is the subject, right? And that the finite is did, because a mouse took, you have to unpack it as did take. Think about how do you know that's the finite? If you were making this into an interrogative, what would you do? You'd use the word took, unpack it into did take, and move did to the front of the sentence. And so the interrogative would be, did a mouse take a walk? Did a mouse? Did a mouse? That's all you need, right? If you have a mouse did, you know it's declarative. If you have did a mouse, you know it's interrogative. If it was an imperative, it would just be take a walk in a deep dark wood. How about when the Gruffalo catches the mouse and says, what are you? Can you explain, can you find the subject and finite here. Again, pause. You should be able to see that this is an interrogative. We've got the question word what. We have the finite are, and we have the subject you. How would you check what the subject and finite are here? Turn it around into a declarative. What would you say? You'd say you are what, and then you'd replace what with the answer. You'd say you are a mouse. If he knew, if the Gruffalo knew, he'd say you are a mouse. He doesn't know, so he reverses the you and are and makes are you a mouse, but he doesn't know, so he says what are you? Finally, later on, the story doesn't matter, but later on the Gruffalo says something about you'd taste good on a loaf of bread or something like that. And the mouse says, don't call me good, don't call me good. Can you explain the interpersonal, can you find the subject in finite here with don't call me good? Pause again. And now you're back, right? You should realize that this is an imperative. You can imagine it as call me good. Call is the verb, right? The mouse has said, don't call me good. So the mouse has kept it imperative, call me, but made it negative polarity. That's all you could say here, that this is negative polarity. There's no subject. There's no finite. We'd understand that he's talking to the Gruffalo because that's who he's addressing. But other than that, there's nothing. There's nothing else. Sorry, I was distracted for a second. There's nothing else there. It's just an imperative. These are the references that I mentioned earlier if you want to know more. And that's all. Thank you very much. Bye.